Sarah Davis knew the syringe would kill the child before it touched skin. The fluorescent lights of St. Clair Hospital hummed their indifferent frequency as her pulse accelerated to a rhythm that drowned out everything except the small, unconscious girl on the gurney, 7 years old, fragile as porcelain, fragile. Elijah Harper's only daughter lay suspended between worlds while a doctor prepared to end her chance at morning. Sarah's fingers trembled, not with uncertainty, but with the terrible clarity of someone who sees the future written in present motion. The needle gleamed under sterile brightness, and in that crystalline instant, she understood that her entire existence had been leading toward this single, catastrophic choice. She would either watch a child perish through her silence, or she would shatter every rule that had ever defined her professional life, and in doing so, she would save a life while destroying her own. The emergency room at St. Clair Hospital carried the particular heaviness of a Miami evening in late September, when the heat refused to break, even as darkness settled over the city like a thick, damp blanket pressing down on concrete and glass. Sarah Davis moved through the corridor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had spent 12 years navigating the architecture of human suffering. Her white sneakers making soft, rhythmic sounds against linoleum floors that reflected the harsh overhead lighting in pale, ghostly streaks. The smell of disinfectant mingled with something indefinable. The scent of fear, perhaps, or desperation, or the peculiar metallic tang that seemed to accompany trauma, no matter how thoroughly the cleaning crews scrubbed. She had clocked in at 6 that evening, trading brief pleasantries with the departing shift, absorbing their handover notes with the kind of focused attention that had become second nature, her mind already cataloguing patient conditions, medication schedules, the subtle hierarchies and tensions that existed in every hospital ward. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, practical and unremarkable, and her face bore the kind of quiet exhaustion that comes not from a single sleepless night, but from years of witnessing things that cannot be unseen, from holding the hands of dying strangers, from learning that sometimes medicine fails and sometimes it succeeds for reasons no textbook can fully explain. Room 347 had been marked as urgent when she received the assignment. The notation scrawled in Dr. Matthews' characteristically illegible handwriting on the whiteboard near the nurse's station. The patient was a 7-year-old girl, admitted 2 hours earlier after collapsing at home, her symptoms suggesting a severe allergic reaction, though the exact trigger remained unclear. Sarah had read through the preliminary notes 3 times, her trained eye catching details that might seem insignificant to someone less experienced, the timing of the symptoms, the child's known medical history, the medications already administered by the paramedics who had transported her. There was something unsettling about the case, a dissonance she could not immediately name, like a piece of music played in the wrong key. The girl's father was Elijah Harper, a name that carried weight even in a city filled with wealthy, influential people, the kind of man whose presence commanded attention in boardrooms and charity galas, whose financial empire touched industries Sarah could barely comprehend. But in this moment, his power meant nothing against the fragility of his daughter's condition, and Sarah knew that wealth could not purchase the steady hand of a competent caregiver or guarantee the outcome of medical intervention. She approached room 347 with a tray of supplies, her movements deliberate and unhurried, despite the urgency flag on the chart, because panic served no one in an emergency, and the best caregivers she had ever known were those who maintained their composure even when chaos threatened to overwhelm. Through the small rectangular window in the door, she could see the child on the hospital bed, her small form almost swallowed by the white sheets and the tangle of monitoring equipment that surrounded her like some kind of technological cocoon. The girl's skin had taken on a greyish pallor that Sarah immediately recognized as deeply concerning, and her breathing was shallow enough that the rise and fall of her chest seemed almost imperceptible. Elijah Harper stood beside the bed, one hand gripping the metal railing so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his expensive suit rumpled, and his face carved into an expression of such raw vulnerability that Sarah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy despite the social chasm between them. This was a father watching his child slip away, and in that fundamental human terror, wealth and status dissolved into irrelevance. Dr. Andrew Matthews was already in the room when Sarah entered, his back to her, as he prepared an injection at the small counter near the window. He was a man in his early 50s, respected in his field, but also known among the nursing staff for a certain arrogance, a tendency to dismiss input from those he considered beneath his expertise. Sarah had worked with him on dozens of cases over the years, and she had learned to navigate his moods, to offer suggestions in ways that allowed him to claim them as his own insights, to maintain professional courtesy even when his condescension grated against her pride. He did not acknowledge her entrance, too focused on drawing medication into a syringe with movements that should have been routine but somehow seemed hurried, almost agitated. Sarah set her tray down on the mobile cart and moved to check the girl's vital signs, her fingers automatically reaching for the blood pressure cuff while her eyes scanned the monitoring equipment displays. The numbers were not good. Heart rate elevated, blood pressure dangerously low, oxygen saturation hovering at a level that suggested the body was struggling to maintain basic functions. Sarah's gaze drifted to the medication vials on the counter where Dr. Matthews worked, and something cold and sharp lodged itself in her chest. The label on one of the vials caught the light, and she read it 3 times in rapid succession, certain she must be mistaken, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes plainly showed. The medication he was preparing was entirely wrong for the patient's condition, not just ineffective, but actively lethal given the child's current state and the substances already in her system. Sarah's medical training kicked in with brutal clarity, her memory retrieving relevant drug interactions, contraindications, the case studies she had reviewed during her continuing education courses. If that injection entered the girl's bloodstream, it would trigger a cascade of physiological responses that would almost certainly result in cardiac arrest within minutes. And given the child's already compromised condition, resuscitation would likely fail. The certainty of this knowledge hit Sarah with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath and flooding her system with adrenaline that made her hands shake and her vision narrow to a single focal point, the syringe in Dr. Matthews's hand. Time seemed to fragment and expand, each second stretching into something elastic and strange, as Sarah watched the doctor turn toward the patient's bedside. The filled syringe held with the casual confidence of someone performing a routine procedure. She opened her mouth to speak, to question the medication choice, to suggest he double-check the order, but the words tangled in her throat because challenging a doctor's decision in front of a patient's family was a boundary she had been trained never to cross, a violation of hierarchy that could cost her job, her reputation, her entire career. The professional conditioning was strong, years of being taught to defer to physicians, to trust their judgment, to understand her place in the medical ecosystem. But beneath that conditioning, something more primal was screaming, a voice that had nothing to do with hospital politics or professional courtesy, and everything to do with the fundamental human imperative to prevent harm. Sarah watched Dr. Matthews approach the bedside, watched him prepare to insert the needle into the IV line, watched Elijah Harper's desperate, trusting face as he stepped back to give the doctor room to work. And in that crystalline and terrible moment, Sarah Davis made a choice that would shatter the careful architecture of her professional life and reveal exactly what kind of person she was when institutional authority collided with moral clarity. The motion came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, a reflexive lunge born from instinct rather than calculated decision, Sarah's hand shooting forward to intercept Dr. Matthews's arm just as the needle approached the IV port. Her fingers closed around his wrist with surprising strength, the kind of grip that comes from absolute certainty, and she felt the resistance of his muscle and bone beneath her palm, the shock that rippled through his body as he registered the physical intervention. The syringe wavered in his grasp, still intact but suspended in a moment of frozen confrontation, and Sarah could feel the heat of multiple gazes converging on her. The doctor's stunned anger, Elijah Harper's confused alarm, the ambient attention of the room itself seeming to contract around this singular violation. Her heart hammered against her ribs with such force she thought it might be audible, a percussion of panic and determination that drowned out the steady beep of monitoring equipment, and her breath came in short, controlled bursts as she fought to maintain her composure, while her entire nervous system screamed warnings about what she had just done. Dr. Matthews's face transformed through a rapid sequence of emotions, shock giving way to outrage, his eyebrows drawing together and his jaw clenching as color flooded into his cheeks. He tried to jerk his arm free from Sarah's grip, but she held firm, her other hand moving instinctively to intercept the syringe itself, her fingers wrapping around the barrel with a desperation that surprised even her. The physical struggle lasted only seconds, but felt eternal, a grotesque dance of professional violation playing out beside the unconscious child's bedside. And Sarah was acutely aware of how this must appear, a nurse physically restraining a doctor, preventing him from treating a patient, stepping so far outside the boundaries of acceptable behavior that there could be no walking it back. Dr. Matthews' voice exploded into the space between them, loud and sharp with authority and genuine fury, demanding to know what she thought she was doing, ordering her to release him immediately, his words carrying the weight of years of institutional power and the assumption that his commands would be obeyed without question. Sarah's voice, when she finally found it, came out steadier than she had any right to expect, though she could hear the tremor beneath the words, the fear and adrenaline that colored every syllable. She told him the medication was wrong, that the dosage and the drug itself were contraindicated for the patient's current condition, that administering it would likely kill the child within minutes. The words tumbled out in a rush, technical terms and clinical observations mixing with raw urgency, and she watched Dr. Matthews' expression shift from pure anger to something more complex, a flicker of doubt, perhaps, or simply deepening rage at being challenged so publicly and so physically. Elijah Harper moved closer, his tall frame casting a shadow across the bed, his voice cutting through the tension to demand an explanation, to ask what was happening, to express the confusion and terror of a parent watching medical professionals fight over his daughter's treatment. The room had become a pressure cooker of conflicting energies, each person locked in their own experience of this impossible moment, and Sarah felt the full weight of her transgression settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. With one final, decisive movement, Sarah managed to extract the syringe from Dr. Matthews's grip, her hand closing fully around it as she stepped back from the bedside, creating physical distance between the medication and the patient. The doctor's face had gone red, his breathing audible and ragged, and Sarah could see in his eyes the calculation happening, the assessment of whether to escalate the physical confrontation or to pivot into a different kind of battle. She held the syringe at her side, not threatening but not surrendering, her body positioned between Dr. Matthews and the IV line, as if she could somehow physically shield the unconscious girl from the lethal injection. Her mind raced through the next steps, knowing she needed to articulate her concerns clearly and quickly to provide evidence for her intervention before hospital security arrived or before Dr. Matthews reasserted his authority through sheer force of position. She began speaking rapidly, citing the specific drug interactions she had identified, referencing the patient's chart and the medications already administered by the paramedics, laying out the clinical reasoning that had driven her desperate action. Dr. Matthews listened with a face like stone, his jaw working as if he were physically chewing through his anger, and Sarah could see him beginning to review the information, his medical training forcing him to consider the possibility that he might have made an error, even as his ego resisted the humiliation of being corrected by a nurse. Elijah Harper demanded that someone check the records immediately, his voice carrying the command of someone accustomed to having his orders followed, and the urgency in his tone seemed to penetrate the fog of professional conflict. Dr. Matthews moved to the computer terminal mounted on the wall, his movements stiff with poorly contained fury, and pulled up the patient's complete medical history, the medication administration record, the notes from the paramedics. Sarah watched his face as he scanned the information, watched the precise moment when understanding dawned and the color began to drain from his cheeks, replaced by a grayish pallor that mirrored the unconscious child's complexion. The silence that followed stretched out for what felt like hours, but could only have been seconds, a pregnant pause filled with the weight of near catastrophe and the terrible knowledge that Sarah had been right. The doctor's hands were trembling when he finally looked up from the screen, and Sarah saw something in his eyes that might have been gratitude or might have been pure terror at how close he had come to killing a patient. He did not apologize, did not thank her, but the way he carefully avoided her gaze spoke volumes about the magnitude of what had almost occurred. He ordered a different medication, his voice subdued and professionally distant, and Sarah moved to prepare it with hands that shook only slightly, the adrenaline still flooding her system but beginning to ebb as the immediate crisis passed. She administered the correct treatment with meticulous care, double-checking every detail, hyper-aware of Elijah Harper's presence hovering at the bedside, watching her every movement with an intensity that made her skin prickle. The child's vitals began to stabilize within minutes, the monitoring equipment registering small but significant improvements, and Sarah felt a wave of relief so profound it nearly buckled her knees. She had saved a life, but she had also detonated her career, and as Dr. Matthews left the room without another word, his silence more ominous than any threat, Sarah understood that the real consequences of her defiance were only beginning to unfold. The remainder of Sarah's shift unfolded in a strange, dissociated haze, as if she were watching herself move through the familiar routines from somewhere outside her body, observing but not quite inhabiting the actions of checking vitals, updating charts, responding to call lights with mechanical efficiency. The other nurses had heard about the incident within an hour. Hospital gossip moved faster than any official communication channel, and Sarah could feel the weight of their gazes whenever she entered the nurses' station, could sense the mixture of awe and concern and professional distance that her colleagues maintained. Some offered quiet words of support, brief touches on her shoulder as they passed, acknowledgements that what she had done was brave, even if it was also deeply problematic within the hierarchy of medical authority. Others avoided her entirely, as if proximity to someone who had so spectacularly violated protocol might contaminate them by association, might mark them as similarly insubordinate in the eyes of administration. Dr. Matthews had not returned to the floor after leaving room 347, and Sarah learned through the nursing supervisor that he had filed an incident report citing her for physical interference with the physician's duties, for undermining his medical judgment in front of a patient's family, for creating a dangerous precedent that could erode the trust necessary for effective teamwork. The language of the report, as relayed to Sarah in a tense conversation in the supervisor's office just before midnight, was clinical and damning, framing her intervention not as life-saving but as reckless. as a symptom of overconfidence that could have resulted in patient harm if her assessment had been incorrect. The supervisor, a woman named Patricia, whom Sarah had always respected for her fairness and pragmatism, seemed genuinely torn between administrative obligation and human recognition of what had actually occurred in that room. She explained that there would need to be a formal investigation, that Sarah would likely be suspended pending review, that the hospital's risk management team was already involved because of who the patient's father was and how easily this situation could escalate into litigation or public scrutiny. Sarah listened to the recitation of consequences with a strange calm, as if the information were being delivered to someone else, as if the professional identity being dismantled piece by piece belonged to a different person entirely. She asked Patricia whether the child was stable, whether Elijah Harper's daughter had continued to improve, and when the supervisor confirmed that the girl was responding well to the correct treatment and would likely make a full recovery, Sarah felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, exactly, but a kind of grim satisfaction that at least the cost of her defiance had purchased something real. She had traded her career for a child's life, and however the administrative machinery chose to process this situation, that essential transaction remained unchanged. Patricia's expression softened as she looked at Sarah across the cluttered desk, and she said quietly that off the record, most of the nursing staff believed Sarah had done the right thing, that Dr. Matthews had been known to make errors in judgment before, though never one quite so potentially catastrophic. The early hours of the morning found Sarah in the hospital cafeteria, the fluorescent-lit space nearly empty except for a handful of overnight staff consuming vending machine coffee and trying to maintain consciousness through the deadest stretch of their shifts. She sat at a corner table with lukewarm tea she did not remember purchasing, staring at the institutional beige walls and trying to process the enormity of what had happened and what would happen next. Her phone buzzed periodically with messages from colleagues, from friends, from her younger sister who had somehow already heard through the mysterious network of connections that seemed to link everyone in Miami's medical community. Sarah ignored most of them, not because she did not appreciate the support, but because she lacked the emotional capacity to engage with the outside world while her internal landscape was still reeling. She thought about the moment of grabbing the syringe, replayed it endlessly in her mind, examining her motivations and wondering whether she had truly acted from moral clarity or from some deeper psychological need to be the hero, to prove something to herself or to the world. The question dissolved before she could answer it, because regardless of motivation, the outcome remained the same: a child who would wake up tomorrow morning, who would grow and learn and experience the thousand small joys and sorrows that constituted a human life, who existed now only because Sarah had been willing to risk everything in a single, irrevocable moment. That had to be enough, she told herself. Had to be sufficient justification for whatever professional destruction followed. But beneath the rational acceptance, fear coiled in her stomach like something alive and predatory, whispering about unemployment and damaged reputation, about the possibility that no hospital would hire her after this, that she might have to leave nursing entirely, retrain for some other profession, start over at 32, with nothing but the knowledge that she had been right once when it mattered most. The fluorescent lights hummed their constant, indifferent song, and Sarah Davis sat alone in the cafeteria and contemplated the price of moral courage in a system that valued hierarchy and institutional protection above individual acts of defiance. When her shift finally ended at 6 in the morning, Sarah walked out into a Miami dawn that painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, the heat already building despite the early hour, humidity clinging to her skin like a second layer. The parking structure where she had left her car felt miles away, though it was only across the street, and she moved through the space with legs that felt heavy and unreliable. Exhaustion finally catching up with her, now that the adrenaline had fully metabolized and left her system depleted. She sat in her car for long minutes before starting the engine, her hands resting on the steering wheel and her eyes unfocused, and she allowed herself a moment of pure feeling, not triumph or regret, but something more complex, a cocktail of emotions that included relief and fear and a strange, hollow pride. She had done the right thing, and it might cost her everything, and both of those facts could be simultaneously true without cancelling each other out. Sarah started the engine and navigated out of the parking structure, joining the early morning traffic of a city that knew nothing and cared nothing about her personal crisis, and she drove home through streets that looked exactly as they had the day before, unchanged by the fact that her entire life had pivoted on a single desperate choice made in a sterile hospital room under the gaze of a dying child. The formal suspension came 3 days later, delivered via certified mail to Sarah's small apartment in a modest neighborhood southwest of downtown, the envelope bearing the hospital's official logo and the kind of bureaucratic weight that made her hands shake as she opened it. The letter was professionally cold, outlining the investigation process, informing her that she would not be permitted on hospital property during the review period, explaining that her access to medical records and internal systems had been temporarily revoked pending the committee's findings. There was no acknowledgement of the life she had saved, no recognition of the accuracy of her clinical judgment, only the dry recitation of policy violations and procedural infractions. Sarah read the letter 3 times, sitting on her couch in pajama pants and an old t-shirt, the morning sun streaming through her apartment's single window and illuminating dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny, aimless spirits. She should have felt panic or anger, but instead, there was only a numbing resignation, as if some part of her had known from the moment she grabbed that syringe that this outcome was inevitable. The days that followed took on a strange, suspended quality, a liminal space between her old life and whatever came next, and Sarah found herself unmoored from the routines that had structured her existence for over a decade. She slept at irregular hours, her body confused by the sudden absence of shift work, waking at 3 in the afternoon or midnight with equal probability. She read nursing journals and watched television and walked through her neighborhood for hours at a time, trying to process what had happened and what it meant for her future. Friends called and visited, bringing food and company and carefully neutral support that avoided taking explicit sides in the conflict between her actions and institutional authority. Her sister drove up from the Keys and spent an entire weekend camped on Sarah's couch, offering the kind of uncomplicated loyalty that only family could provide, insisting that Sarah had done nothing wrong and that any system that punished her for saving a child's life was fundamentally broken. The hearing took place 2 weeks after the suspension in a conference room at St. Clair Hospital that Sarah had walked past hundreds of times but never entered. The administrative committee consisted of 5 people: the chief of medicine, the nursing director, a representative from risk management, a human resources official, and an outside consultant brought in to provide impartial assessment. Dr. Matthews was there, seated at the far end of the long table, his expression carefully neutral, though Sarah thought she detected something haunted in his eyes, a recognition of how close he had come to destroying more than just her career. Sarah sat across from the committee with her union representative beside her, a competent woman named Angela, who had spent the previous 3 days helping her prepare testimony and documentation, gathering supporting evidence from Sarah's employment record, from colleagues willing to provide character statements, from medical literature that confirmed the lethal nature of the medication error she had prevented. The hearing unfolded with procedural formality, each person given time to present their perspective, the committee asking questions with the kind of detached professionalism that suggested they were performing a required ritual rather than genuinely seeking truth. Dr. Matthews acknowledged that Sarah's clinical judgment had been correct, that he had indeed been about to administer a contraindicated medication, that her intervention had prevented serious patient harm. But he insisted, with the careful language of someone protecting himself from liability, that the manner of her intervention had been inappropriate, that she should have voiced her concerns verbally rather than physically restraining him, that her actions had undermined medical hierarchy in ways that could create dangerous precedents. Sarah listened to him speak and felt a cold anger settling in her chest, not at the words themselves, but at the willingness to prioritize institutional order over human life, to suggest that preserving chain of command was somehow more important than preventing a child's death. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she chose her words carefully, explaining her thought process in that critical moment, describing the split-second calculation that had led her to act physically rather than verbally, because there had simply not been time for debate or explanation. She acknowledged that her actions had been unconventional, that she understood why they appeared problematic from an administrative perspective, but she refused to apologize for saving a life or to express regret for prioritizing patient safety over professional courtesy. She could see the committee members' reactions, the subtle shifts in posture and expression that suggested some level of sympathy, even as they maintained their evaluative distance. The union representative presented documentation of Sarah's exemplary employment record, 12 years without a single disciplinary action, numerous commendations from patients and colleagues, continuing education completed far beyond the minimum requirements. The case was made as strongly as it could be, and then there was nothing left to do but wait for the committee to deliberate and render their decision. The verdict came 2 days later, delivered via phone call from the nursing director, and the carefully worded compromise managed to satisfy no one while technically resolving the situation. Sarah would be reinstated to her position, but with a formal reprimand in her personnel file, a notation that would follow her through any future employment in healthcare, marking her as someone who had violated protocol, even if the violation had been medically justified. She would be required to complete additional training on proper channels for reporting medical errors and concerns about physician judgment, a bureaucratic requirement that felt like punishment disguised as education. Dr. Matthews would face no formal discipline, though Sarah learned through the hospital rumor network that he had voluntarily requested a transfer to a different facility, unable or unwilling to continue working in an environment where his near-fatal error had become common knowledge. The hospital's risk management team had settled quietly with Elijah Harper, though the terms were confidential, ensuring his silence about the incident in exchange for compensation and the knowledge that his daughter had survived. Sarah returned to work 3 weeks after the hearing, walking back into St. Clair Hospital through the same entrance she had used for years, but everything felt subtly different, as if the building itself had rearranged while she was gone. Her colleagues greeted her with warmth, but also with a certain caution, an awareness that she had become someone marked by controversy, someone whose presence reminded everyone of the uncomfortable truth that sometimes doing the right thing meant violating the rules that were supposed to keep order and safety in balance. She resumed her shifts, checking vitals and administering medications and offering comfort to patients who knew nothing of her recent turmoil. And she found that muscle memory carried her through the tasks, even when her mind wandered to that moment in room 347, to the weight of the syringe in her hand, to the choice that had defined her more clearly than any other single action in her life. The reprimand remained in her file, a permanent scar on her professional record, But when Sarah looked at herself in the bathroom mirror at the end of her first shift back, she saw someone who could meet her own gaze without shame, someone who had paid the price of defiance and found that the cost, however steep, was one she could live with, because a 7-year-old girl was alive somewhere in Miami, breathing and laughing and growing, oblivious to the bureaucratic battle that had been waged over her survival, and that singular fact made everything else bearable.